The air above the fairgrounds shimmered like liquid heat, the smell of dust and livestock thick enough to coat the back of your throat. It was the kind of summer day that made the wooden bleachers creak from the weight of men shifting under the relentless sun, Stetsons pulled low to shade weathered faces. The annual livestock auction was a small-town tradition. Of cattle, horses, pigs, the occasional goat, and everyone from 3 counties showed up to buy, sell, and gossip. But this year, the whispers had started long before the first gavel strike. Every man, woman, and child who'd wandered through the creaking gates had heard some version of it. The final lot on the list wasn't an animal at all. Nobody could agree on the truth. A few old-timers claimed it was a rare imported racehorse kept in hiding by the sheriff. Others swore it was a bear from some defunct traveling circus. Some of the more wild storytellers half-drunk before noon swore it was a person. Nobody believed them, of course. People came for animals, not for a broken bar, whatever that would be. Still, the crowd swelled as the day went on, the tension mounting as each animal came and went, until there was nothing left on the auctioneer's list except Lot 57A special entry. The auctioneer, a round man with suspenders that looked ready to snap, wiped his forehead with a red handkerchief. He stepped up to the podium, his voice booming through the tinny loudspeakers. "All right folks, you've been patient. We've reached our final lot of the day. I'll warn ya, this here's something mighty unusual." He drew out the words, milking the curiosity until you could feel it buzzing in the air like static before a storm. "Now, keep your wits about you. Bring her out." Gasps and startled murmurs rippled through the bleachers as 2 broad-shouldered men emerged from behind the gate, letting in not a horse, not a cow, but a human figure. She was massive. The woman stood easily 7 feet tall, her shoulders wide, her posture rigid. She wore a faded, shapeless dress that hung all the way to her boots, and her hands were covered by worn leather gloves. The strangest part, thought with the part that made more than a few children duck behind their parents, was her head. Covered completely in a coarse burlap sack, tied tight at the neck. No eye holes. No mouth slit. Just rough fabric where a face should have been. "Lord above," someone whispered. "What in the hell, a broken bar?" Another muttered. "That ain't no woman, that's a stunt," a rancher barked from the front row. The auctioneer held up his hands. "She's real, folks. Ain't no trick. Now I ain't here to answer questions about where she came from or why she's here. That's for the buyer to decide. Bidding starts at $1. The silence was thick enough to hear the wind through the dry grass. No one moved. No one even cleared their throat. The woman stood perfectly still, her chest rising and falling slow and steady. The 2 handlers kept their grips on her arms, but it didn't look like she needed holding. She wasn't struggling, she was waiting. Then, from the very back of the bleachers, a low voice called out, $2. The crowd twisted around in unison. There he was, Elijah Cross. Folks in town knew the name, though not much else about the man. He was a rancher, lived way out past the northern ridge where the land turned into a mess of rocky outcroppings and wild sage. He rarely came to town except for supplies, and when he did, he didn't linger. Tall, lean, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a permanent shadow of stubble across his jaw, Elijah had the quiet sort of presence that made people step aside without knowing why. People laughed at first in nervous, sharp bursts of it. "You in a circus act now, Cross?" someone jeered. But Elijah didn't respond. He just kept his gaze on the giant woman, his hat tipped slightly forward. The auctioneer blinked, clearly surprised anyone had bid at all. "You at broken bar, $2 from Mr. Cross. Do I hear 3? Silence again. A few men glanced at their wives, who gave them tight, warning shakes of the head. No one wanted to bring a broken bar home. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold." "To Mr. Elijah Cross for $2. The handlers released her arms and stepped back. Elijah walked forward with the slow, steady stride of a man unfazed by the weight of every eye in the place. He stopped in front of her, tipped his hat in a gesture that was oddly polite, and took her gloved hand. She didn't resist. Without a word, he turned and led her out of the ring, the crowd parting like water around them. The whispers followed the wild theories, crude jokes, and more than a few uneasy mutters. The sun was low by the time Elijah's wagon creaked up the dirt road to his ranch. The land stretched for miles, open and empty, save for the weathered cabin and the leaning barn. He helped her down from the wagon, still silent, and led her inside. The interior was simply wood walls, a small kitchen table, a cast iron stove. A single lantern flickered on the table, casting long shadows across the room. He motioned for her to sit. "Coffee?" he asked. No answer. He poured 2 cups anyway, sliding one across the table. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, the burlap sack still over her head. Elijah leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I don't know what your story is, and I ain't the type to pry. But if we're gonna live under the same roof, I ought to know your name." The silence stretched. The only sound was the slow tick of the clock on the wall and the faint creak of the cabin settling. Then, without warning, she reached up and untied the rope at her neck. The sack slid off, falling to the table with a dull thud. Elijah's breath caught. Her face was unlike any he'd seen, and not monstrous, not scarred, but striking in a way that seemed ominous to Broken Bar unreal. Her skin was pale as river stone, her eyes a molten gold that caught the lantern light and held it. Her hair was black as midnight, falling in thick waves over her shoulders. She looked him straight in the eye and said, in a voice deep and melodic, "Marrow." The word seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Elijah froze, his fingers curling slowly away from the coffee mug. It wasn't the name itself that chilled him, it was the stories that name carried. Marrow. The name whispered in old frontier campfires, in saloons, in hushed tones by prospectors who swore they'd heard it in the mines before their partners vanished. A name tied to the lost gold town of Callow's End, swallowed whole by a landslide 50 years ago. The legend said there was a woman there, taller than any man, who knew the mountain's secrets and guarded something precious, a something no one who sought it ever lived to claim. People swore she died with the town. But here she was, sitting in his kitchen. Elijah's voice was low when he spoke again. "That name's supposed to be a ghost story." Her golden eyes didn't blink. "Do I look like a ghost to you?" The lantern flame flickered, and for just a heartbeat, Elijah could have sworn her shadow on the wall was bigger, taller than it should have been. He didn't answer. Somewhere outside, a lone coyote howled, and the sound seemed to echo a little too long in the empty hills. Elijah had paid $2 for a stranger. But tonight, as the darkness closed in around the cabin, he knew he hadn't bought a stranger at all. He'd married a legend of Broken Bar, and whatever came next, there was no undoing it.